In this video, we're going to go 20 feet into the ground, and I'm going to show you petroglyphs and caves and tombs and sealed doors and all kinds of things that we've discovered over the last 5 years that I've been researching this. In this video, I wanted to go over how I got into doing this type of research and why and what possessed me to try to understand it more. And the story itself, it all started back when a good friend of mine, Caleb, came over to my house, and he had gotten back from seeing some friends, and there was a gentleman who showed him these pieces and told him that they were 10,000 years old, and that he had been down there and excavated them himself, and with an archaeologist who had just appeared on the show America Unearthed with Scott Woltar. And Scott Woltar and Mark Russell did scans on that TV show in 2019 that went through and carbon dated and looked at these in a closer field of view. And at the end of the show, Scott ends it with, if this is true, it's going to change everything. And boy, was he right. Boy, was he right. But he also said, with extraordinary claims requires extraordinary proof. And at that time, the proof that he had with the carbon dates, etc., was only a sliver of what was about to unfold. And when I heard this, I didn't believe it. And I said, if this was true, it would be on every station, every podcast. This is the most insane thing I've ever seen. I mean, at the time, it was just some small carvings with alien-looking beings on them. There was no anything else, some symbols and just these aliens with all these little spheres and blowing out what looked to be like a soul or something of this nation, just like a genie or a jinn type form of yourself that was coming out of your mouth, and it reminded me of a psychedelic type experience where you leave your body and, you see it laying behind you and you're now a soul. And so it's been an interesting task. I didn't believe it, and I shook his hand at that point and wagered him some money to try to disprove it. I figured that I could make a few phone calls and come to a real rational understanding that this was obviously a hoax, right? And so at that time, I went on eBay and I started buying some of these pieces to verify. I asked him, if I could get the contact information of where he got some of his pieces. He gave me that at that time. And so I started buying some of these and looking at them closer, trying to understand, trying to reach out to different people who are in this type of business or industry, experts on the field, including Scott, which inevitably we did get in contact. I worked with Linda Moulton Howe on this for some time, as she was very curious and had also experienced some of these tablets from the Miko-chan, where she took to Stanford University, and they laughed at her and wouldn't even perform the science on these. And that's pretty disappointing, because it really, she said it could have affected her career really negatively, and kind of did in some aspects, and she felt really bad about it. And that's too bad, because she's a really great person and does really good, documentation and investigative journalism. So that's why I reached out to her in the first place. And so to hear that she had gone through this, and then, she wanted to send, she wanted to come down to Mexico and send a crew down there to dig these pieces up. That's what we worked on together. She created pamphlets and different things, and this was really the first person that responded to me. I reached out to quite a few different people to try to understand this, and it didn't seem like anyone wanted to respond at all. I just left on read or not seen, or whatever you want to say. And so it was a interesting time, because I figured that, seeing these items, it would either be, oh, those are fake, or, oh my goodness, I need to research that, and so it's kind of an odd reception, I should say. And so as we went down the road further, Linda inevitably stopped responding to me one day, and it's been kind of like that with any of the Prometheus ancient alien type people, or anyone's connected to that to that tree, and I don't know if it's due to a non-disclosure agreement. Some people cornered Nick Pope there at the Contact in the Desert, and he said he couldn't talk about it or wouldn't talk about it, something of that nature. And I don't know what to think, coming across some of these hurdles and these roadblocks that lay in the way. People who are experts in this or that claim to be, this should be the most amazing thing that they have ever seen. And so we didn't have really a lot of science. I'd seen the carbon dates from Scott as well as from another researcher, Oleg Elistrov, who had published a book at that time called Mexico Paleo Contact. And this book was a real staple in pursuing the research, because I knew that, a PhD attached his name to this book and this publication showing different dates and different things of excavation and where these things were coming from. And it lined up exactly with what I had researched and what I had found and the people that I were working with at that time. And I started working with many different people in Mexico. There was a gentleman who essentially introduced me to his cousin down there, and through his cousin I met many other sellers and people who were involved with this, trying to understand it, and just more so anything, I thought that I would be able to get a different story somewhere, or get the truth from one of them by offering them something, or somewhere along the line there would be a mistake made that I could get to the bottom of this. And one thing after another, as you see in the videos that I've been showing, is just, it's nonstop and it's insanely detailed. There's a lot going on, from the beads to the, large statues that weigh, 500 plus pounds, to things that are of gold and different material alloys that are very complex. And, we know from modern archaeology that it's the Anunnaki are said to have given a lot of these things to the Sumerians. And you look at Egyptian history with when the gods walked with man and Zepteki or Tepseki, one of the two. And nonetheless, this story is interesting, because we see some of these Egyptian beings and some of these Egyptian motifs, Sumerian motifs, Anunnaki beings, gods from both places, and gods that we've never seen before, or beings of God's stature in terms of having an animal head and a human body. And so that to me was a really interesting connection, because both places have extensive pyramid complexes, and I don't think that's an accident with how complex the pyramids are to build today, and with our lack of knowledge of building them. It would make sense that there was a more advanced civilization at some point that we're missing in that timeline. And people like Graham Hancock have talked about this, and obviously there's shows completely built on this notion that it's possible. And so nonetheless, it's really an interesting take to tie it all together and find that, okay, this might be that civilization. These items might be crafted in that fashion. And so it took a long time of disbelief, seeing these type of tombs, the petroglyphs, that sort of thing. It really opened my perception to maybe what if. I knew when I saw the petroglyphs at the 15 and 16 foot dig level that it was a really high probability that it was genuine. I couldn't see that these guys would have buried that, let alone there was an entire documentary filmed in this area, and they didn't have the money to go any deeper because they had reached a third ground floor, and that's called Gen 6 Expeditions from Gen 6 Productions. And so it's really an interesting thing. They inspired me a lot doing this documentary along the way, because I'd lost faith a lot of times. Anytime I would post this stuff, anytime, it would just always be, that's a hoax, that's not true. Even from people with credible academics in the industry, people with TV shows, things of that nature. And so it was discouraging at times. However, people out there doing documentaries to the caliber that Gen 6 did. And what's interesting is they released a trailer, and the trailer was just, it showed more than I'd ever seen. Getting the guys to document things like this, showing this in the ground in this fashion, was extremely challenging. At the time, the phone quality was not very great down there, and there just wasn't a real want to get in trouble. This stuff's being excavated out of the ground, and normally it would be very, very illegal to excavate things out of the ground. But in this case, Dr. Pablo Garcia Sanchez wrote to the INAH, who's the Institute of Anthropology and Archaeology in Mexico, and on Mexican letterhead, they wrote a letter back to him claiming that these items were modern and were not real because aliens and this type of iconography was created in the recent century. And that was their reason that it was all modern and that it was okay to buy and sell these items. So that left it in terms of, we have this posted on our website, and it leaves it really open because these guys are technically allowed to go dig this stuff up. And as long as they're not, disturbing pre-Hispanic pieces, then it's totally okay. Even if the National Guard or the INAH were to pull up on them directly, it would be really hard for them to get into trouble for it. They would probably just be told to stop or something of this nature, because these pieces depict something that they say is not possible due to the fact that these things were created modernly. Well, the interesting thing here is the INAH has taken in many of these pieces, and there's a gentleman who I interviewed in my book, Anunnaki America, who goes into detail about him working for them and finding many, many of these pieces. And these pieces would go into a stack. The American archaeologist would put them there. And then the pre-Hispanic pieces would be put into another stack. And they would, display and show the pre-Hispanic pieces in the museums and things of that nature. But this stuff, they wouldn't. This had to be buried modernly. This has to be graffiti. You've heard these things before about certain iconography and certain things in pyramids and other areas. Well, there clearly seems to be something that is trying to prevent this information from coming out. And I would go as far to say that this could be disclosure based on what we've seen and what we found. The extraterrestrial concept, if you look at how deeply tied into Hollywood and things now with it being brought up into such a limelight, and the arguments with our Congress and our governments going back and forth about this topic, and the amount of money and taxpayer dollars that have gone into projects like Skinwalker Ranch, or even just hosting the hearings and having all those people in Washington, D.C. take their days to spend talking about these reports and these skiffs and all these things. Now you look at our current scene of events with Representative Luna on the Joe Rogan podcast coming forward with things that resonate very, very, very closely to what we're finding in terms of ancient religious type things, extra-dimensional rather than extraterrestrial. And I think that's really an important notion to know, that there could be other dimensions in which these beings are with us right here, right now, and we can't even see them or function with them. A lot of people say they are haunted by ghosts, that they've seen these type of things before, and there's a lot of question about, things like the Ouija boards, which you actually saw one here in the photos just prior. The fact we found chessboards and Ouija boards, different divination tools, pendulums, who or what on the other side is pulling on that pendulum? And what's causing that thing to move with the Ouija, and why is it so frowned upon? And a lot of people just say that's a wives' tale or something of this. And, well, if it was, then why did our governments in Europe and the United States burn witches at the stake publicly, not very long ago? This was done, for our governments to sign off on that. They obviously knew that magic was real and that these people posed a threat. Otherwise, I don't think that they would have justified publicly destroying people. And, a lot of people were killed publicly. The Cathar people. And Cathar people accepted Jesus, but they believed in some things that went against our understanding of the Bible today. And that's really, I think, something that needs to be looked at carefully in this, because as I started to research, biblical things, I'm not a religious guy whatsoever. There seemed to be real connections with these stories and what we were seeing, and especially in the non-canonical, Book of Enoch, Book of Ezekiel, that sort of thing. You really get the picture painted. I mean, when in the Book of Ezekiel, it explains what the Elohim looked like, and they looked like the bodies of men with animal heads in some cases, and in some cases a human head. You have to look at Sumeria and Egypt and look at these beings, and not only that, but you look at the shape of Osiris and Akhenaten's head being elongated, Nefertiti, and then the fact that we see Nefertiti depicted on some of these tablets dated 1825 years ago via thermoluminescence. You have to wonder what they knew and how transatlantic this was. And so it brings a lot of questions. And as I progressed through this and talked to some of these other people, I met Scott Wolter, and he gave me some huge amounts of encouragement. This guy was a very good friend in terms of just explaining that there's definitely research that needs to be done, and that's pretty much where he left it. And so at that point, I expected that these scientists would be all over this research to try to understand it. Yet, I tried to have Scott carbon date some things, and the labs were telling him no. He was having a hard time finding a place to do it. It was causing more problems than it seemed to be worth. And it didn't sit well with me, I'm not going to lie. I was frustrated at the institutional situation that we were in. When I contacted the University of Washington, they gave me a reason of why, and that was really good of them, because they said, if these pieces are genuine, then they were unethically extracted from the ground. And in that reason, they don't want to be, tied into it. And I can understand that. I don't really want to be tied into it either. At the same point, the science and the research needs to be done, because if we don't do the research, then we're not ever going to know. And that's not good, because now all this history is being excavated illegally, and we're not ever going to get to know our origins or what the heck's going on. In fact, we're being kept in the dark very highly, it seems, due to the fact that these books that I just mentioned from the Bible that are non-canonical or apocryphal texts seem to resonate so closely with these things. It almost seems like they were selected to be removed to try to remove this chapter of history from existence. All of the things like the Crusades and the conquistadors, how they were funded, how it went down, it could be somewhat prerogative to stop this history from being known. And why has been probably the biggest question that I have, is why would you want to keep this from being disclosed? What about these items? And what justifies killing these witches? Unless, obviously, magic's real. Maybe there's magical powers in these items. Maybe they have potential to do things that are beyond my understanding. A lot of people say a lot of different things about them, about how they feel around them, and what the overall, spiritual or energetic connections they have with them. I don't practice anything like that. I don't use pendulums, and I don't do horoscopes and anything like that, because it feels like, it's one thing I learned when I played video games as a child, is when you put the cheat codes in, it becomes boring and it becomes not very good anymore. It ruins the game, literally guts the game from the inside. And I don't want to do that with life. It might be great to know certain things, but at certain points, at what cost? And that's really where I've drawn the line with this. When I was a young man, I looked at the horoscope almost every day for a period of time. And it was like science to me, because like, how can it know this, and what goes into this, and why? And, you look at where the stems are for that, and the fact that we're finding symbology and things that correspond with it in these pieces. I think that type of divination is part of this, and it seems as if they were very well versed in it because of all the different occult and ritual type objects that we found. It really goes into a whole nother layer of what actually what did these beings possess? We look at our Native Americans and some of the stories of star people and ant people, and that these advanced beings helped us out. They came out from underneath the ground, and there's a lot of different stories. And you look at certain things. There's depictions that seem almost Egyptian down there with the Hopi tribe. And I think they're called Kachinas, I believe that's what it is. And so it's really a thing to see, especially with what Kincaid reported back in the early 1900s, who was a researcher that inevitably ended up working with the Smithsonian to some extent. And he claimed that he'd found these caves in the Grand Canyon, and that there was large giants and sarcophagi and, almost like Egyptian symbology, but different. And the way he describes this in his words and in his journals that have been retrieved, it's absolutely almost like a spitting image of what we found in Mexico. And so the fact that, obviously these places are adjacent and close together, and Mexico used to run up into the Americas, then it would make a lot of sense that some of these tribes and some of these histories would be tied into with what we're finding. And it's been absolutely a blessing to speak with any Native Americans on this topic, because they all have such valuable wisdom to give, the oral traditions and the things that they feel comfortable sharing when they see this stuff has hit me in the heart so strongly, because I feel that certain practices, like the Sundance, for instance, was something that the tribes there, the Sioux and the Lakota, they would practice this, and they would all get together and do this Sundance, and it involved fasting and other types of things, dancing and drums. And well, this was banned by the federal U.S. government. They came in and said, you cannot do this dance in our country anymore. I mean, when I heard that, my jaw hit the floor. Like, why in the world would a government with the Constitution of free religion and free speech and all of these different things go in there and tell the Native Americans that they couldn't practice their dance unless they knew something that was far deeper than what they had led on to, or far more than what we had been taught? And I think that you look at the lost information, whether it be the libraries of Alexandria that burnt, whether it be the World War II book burnings, or even just with the conquistadors and how they got rid of Mayan and different things when they came in, melted all the artifacts, etc. They were very methodical about this for a reason, I'm sure. And I always kind of wondered what that reason was. Was it just to get rich and get the gold? I mean, yeah, humans could definitely come to that level, but why destroy the books and the history at that point? Like, why wouldn't you want to learn from that, or unless there was something about it that you were absolutely trying to get rid of? And that, I believe, is what disclosure is getting rid of this chapter of history, this ancient past. And like I said earlier, when you listen to Representative Luna, who, bless her heart, went on to Joe Rogan and told the truths that she did about what she saw, I'm so thankful for people like this to come forward and put their name in jeopardy to tell us the truth. These people are heroes. So many of these whistleblowers, whether, I kind of question some of the whistleblowers, I'm not going to lie, especially when they had to ask the U.S. government for permission to say what they said. But nonetheless, their names still are on the line for a topic that is absolutely something that seems to be more than what we've been taught. And that's, I guess, why disclosure has loomed within our government for many, many years, and it's been talked about, and studies have been done, and it doesn't seem like we're ready for that is kind of the hypothesis. And when you look at what this stuff shows and how deep it goes into our creation and what we are and how we got to where we are, there could be absolute reason for that. Would I have been ready for this in the 1990s, knowing what we know, without having AI and different things to fact check our experts and corroborate information between experts? In the 90s, you could just pay off PhDs and have them say whatever you want. And you look at some of our things in the food industry and, these artificial dyes and different things they're coming out with now that have been toxic in our foods for how long? Fluoride, etc. There's absolutely, it seems like, a lapse in peer review and science here, or a suppression of science. And that proof, too, is with Nikola Tesla's work. He said he designed a device where he was able to communicate with aliens. Well, what do you suppose that he was actually communicating with these beings in a different dimension, possibly? What exactly are these aliens? And you look at some of the Middle East's texts, like the Quran or the Torah, and you can absolutely see that they talk about these things called jinn. And the story of King Solomon specifically is very, very, very important to this, because, the ring on the finger is a symbol of Saturn, is what I'm learning. And we find Saturn depicted all over these pieces. And how marriage was brought together with this contract or oath, and the type of oath that was taken at Mount Hermon, and the oaths and the contracts that seem to be, throughout our secret societies and Hollywood contracts, music contracts, etc. The leading cause of divorce is marriage. And more people get divorced than stay married at this point. I think it was 53% when I looked last. So that notion is clearly setting us up to be infidels and not succeed. And when you look at what King Solomon was told, that he could control these demons and learn from them, and he wrote down what he learned from them and which ones were this and weak to that, and he's basically the foundation of witchcraft. And so these jinn and these things that inevitably overpowered him and took him out, they say that he lost his protection from God because he became an infidel. And I don't know if that's necessarily the case, but that's what it states. But you look at this ring and this symbology and what he was doing to these demons, it almost seems as if they were trying to get him to bring the witchcraft out and utilizing him in such a position of power. And when you look at the box, that he had in his possession, the Ark of the Covenant, and some of the other relics, it makes you really think, why did Adolf Hitler chase these objects? Why are people doing this? And you look at Adolf Hitler as a great example to this, that he utilized certain types of occult practices through the Vril and Thule societies. You can see that they embellished Saturn as well. There's multiple things of symbology that relate them to this type of history, including the double eagle wings and the black cube of Saturn. And there's different things that, why Saturn in all these places? Why did the Romans have Saturn in their beliefs? And why did they move Christmas after they became the Catholics to Saturnalia? Is that just convenient, or are we actually giving false praise and we don't even know it? These are all things that have to be looked at because of this. And, disclosure is quite complex if you start breaking it down with, where we've been led and what actually might be true. And I think that at this point in time, we can see that there are good forces and bad forces at play. I think the Flintstones had it right when it showed Fred with the angel on one shoulder and the devil on the other. It seems as if we have a connection to the source that Jesus gave us, and this may have saved us from previous races, but it also seems as if we have a connection to something darker as well. And if you look into the story like the Pistis Sophia, which was lost for many, many centuries, millennia, and you see that it's written as Jesus's words to his disciples, and what it talks about in there, it absolutely would make sense that this creation, or this Saturn, is the demiurge. And the Gnostics were pushed out. It's very frowned upon to be Gnostic. Many Christians will say that they believe in the devil or worship bad things, and And I don't think that's the case. I disagree with that to some degree. And in some cases, they may have been because they were misled or manipulated, just as if, other religions that are out there today have been. One that comes to mind is the Mormon Church, because they have certain beliefs about Jesus coming to America after he died and had a second coming here. And I really see a lot of traces of that, especially with the tablets we documented in the 10,000 Year Lie from the Miko-chan. It's definitely something that has to be looked at. There's even one tablet that clearly shows a devil-looking character fighting an angel-looking character, as if it's almost Michael and Satan battling. And it's also included with the goat of Mendez, or Baphomet. And the Baphomet character, I think, is really a critical thing to look at also, of how it came about, how it was illustrated from the descriptions in which it was described by, where it actually originated from, and who it is exactly. Still to be determined, but we do see that character show up now in multiple pieces from multiple locations, Tula and the Miko-chan. These pieces being extracted right now were literally extracted 150 feet from Pyramid B, and this is documented on film. This was a very risky thing that some very brave individuals did to prove, or to try to prove, the legitimacy of these items. And that copper vase there actually has the seal of Metatron on it, or Metatron's cube, and it also has the Boogosphere chip around it, and has a horned character. It's quite interesting to see. Some of these pieces depict what seem to be like good entities, and some depict bad entities. Were they working in harmony together at one point? It shows that's a real plausibility. It's always been something in the Egyptian pantheon that I was curious about, is there would always be, a good god and a bad god that was opposite of the good god, pretty much. And they always had an equal or opposite type of reaction in this case. And that's kind of how we are as a soul. We're dualistic. We can go one way or the other real fast, especially driving down the road when someone cuts you off. And so it's funny to look at that expression that we're all capable of, and the things that we're all capable of doing in terms of sin, and how those are brought about, and what possesses us to do that over what's right. Even though sometimes we know what's right, we still choose what's wrong for whatever purpose. And it doesn't matter how smart you are, to overcome that sin is a whole other obstacle that requires a skill beyond just intelligence, I feel. So as we fast forward through this story, we come to the conclusions in which we finally got a lab to do science for us. Over the last 6 months, we have really picked up speed in terms of research and understanding. There's been people in the community who have stepped up and who have devoted their time and their resources to help us get where we really truly need to go. And people with degrees who want to know the answers just as well as we do, the laboratory, everybody who's come together on this. It's just it's a beautiful act of collaboration for the greater truth for our whole entire society. Why we would try to push something like this under the rug and not research it, having this much evidence, is clear blasphemy to me. And I'm very thankful to have the research done that we've gotten, because it's clearly showing that the materials in which many of these items are made is a complex vitrified aluminum silicate composition. And the way things are displaced and arranged in these items, like carbon and oxygen and all these different chemicals, and how they are put in there, but yet zero synthetics, zero modern day things. To create this stone today, or this geopolymer, would require significant understanding, and likely a more advanced technology than what we have today, especially at the level in which it's being done and carved in which the way it's done. It's one thing to make the geopolymer itself, but then to form it into these complex shapes and to get it into, functional whistles that are within the solfeggio tune, and to get all of these different techniques of carving and inlaying objects, the precision in the carving and how perfect things are, and then also to create the amount of patina that's clearly visible in the scientific scans that we've presented as well. And the way it's displaced is very, very, very. AI said it best. They said it would be impossible to fake the patina in the way that it's spread across the stone and the way and depth in which it's attached to the stone, and that it's actually attached to the stone. And that brings on a whole nother set of research that we looked into, was the glowing green luminescence that you see in the phosphorescent glows that these stones emit oftentimes. And we found that this green luminescence is actually fastened to the stone and bonded to the stone with some sort of fusion process. And so it's fused, it's part of the stone, but yet this phosphor material didn't get damaged in the process, which is a whole nother question. We have videos with this science. We'll also be adding here in the next couple days a section on our website that will be all of this research with proper organization and access to understand it better yourself, and go ahead and try to peer review it or fact check it. I welcome anyone to utilize simple scanning electron microscopes and go in and find out if they come up with the same data and the same realizations that we have, because it's clear that there is technology and advanced creation of these type of materials that's going on here that we don't possess, or at least we do not enact on. Not to say we couldn't do it, but to do it to this level and this degree and this amount of fabrication, let alone having the structural understanding of these pieces. Some of them are park benches, some of them are sarcophagi that are thousands of pounds, some of them are chairs, thrones. We found a lot of different things, and they're all completely carved to the T, and yet they're supportive. So the way that they were able to fabricate and manufacture this stone, they had complete control over its structural abilities, and I believe they were masters of it, and the proof is in the pieces, and also the non-homogeneous qualities of this material. You clearly see that it was done in a very primitive way, or as if you were crushing it and making it up right there at the on the spot each time, I guess, in a small batch would be the best way to present that. It's none of it seems to be commercially created with commercial machines to do the crushing and whatnot. We see a lot of variety in that sort of sense compared to, say, modern concrete or any of those type of materials like that. There is a ton more data to go over on this process as well. We've only released some things that we fully understand or that we have a good enough understanding of. We really need peer review to go forward with this science too much further. However, things are standing out which are obvious, and that's the great part, because it's so easily confirmable and something that can be checked independently across the world. It doesn't require a $1 million laboratory to do so, and that's a great thing, because carbon dating and certain testing is very limited, and who controls those machines, and it's a lot easier said than done if you want to get something dated, I'll tell you that much. And it's a complex process, and I understand why, but it's not always accurate, and it requires knowing a lot about where the product's coming from, the chain of custody, and all of those things. So at this point, we have quite a few carbon dating and thermoluminescent tests that we can go off of, and a host more ordered up as well, and a lot of tests on bones and things of that nature, which we haven't had in the past from any of these locations. So we should start to see some dates in the near future that give us an idea of when some of these items were manufactured and created, because there's a huge variance right now in the dates that we do see between, say ceramics that look like this type of stuff versus these stone pieces from, say, Abuelos de Jalisco, which some of them date over 20,000 years ago. At least that's what the carbon date says. Again, we can't trust that fully until we have more information. If we have 4 or 5 bones that come up with that same date range, then it would be probably much more believable than just the adhesive or something of this nature, because adhesives are made oftentimes from organic materials like copal resin and different saps and things like that. So that stuff could have been already petrified or aged in the ground when they took it out to harvest it, to utilize it. So the age there could be very, very inconsistent. And that's why it's hard to really say what time frame we're dealing with, because until recent, we haven't had a lot of bones to work with. It seems as if the amount of bones that we find, there are not a lot of corpses around in this area. And that could be because we see extensive evidence of a flood and bodies float. Things could have been moved or decomposed in a way in which would be different than, say, a fossilization event or a, who knows, a famine or however else it breaks down and gets covered up into the ground. We do find funerary and burial areas, and the Toltec tribe that excavates these sites, that find this, they refuse to disturb those sites because it's highly illegal, and they have respect for their elders. So we've never been able to get testing on that type of remains, unfortunately. However, there have been a couple necklaces that have bone pieces as the beads, as well as daggers in which have bone hilts. So those are items that we are testing, and hopefully we'll get some answers on in the near future. I think that in corroboration with some of these other adhesives and also the thermoluminescent potentials of stuff like the cave. The cave can be dated in terms of the quartz if we dig down inside and get some undisturbed soil in the dark and keep it in the dark and get that tested. It should give us a good example of when the cave was dug out, and that could be very, very interesting as well. Seeing the petroglyphs and the type of iconography, it does match with a lot of the pieces that we do find, so they could absolutely have a similar age. And we find coins as well, which is really interesting. Seeing a currency, seeing functional items that have power supplies or some sort of battery built into them. They still power lights and function today. One has copper electrodes. We're going to be doing a documentary on this in the near future, next month actually, in September and 2025. And that documentary is going to go over how these electrical systems work, and it seems almost as like it's like the Baghdad battery type understanding. There are copper electrodes that are placed, or copper contact points to carry or to transmit the energy. There's also a lot of magnetic application utilized in some of these pieces. Large skull whistles that hang from things above. There's all kinds of things that float because of magnetism. Different UFOs and pyramids. Literally one that looks almost like our dollar bill. It's a pyramid, and then it has a pyramid capstone. And if you get it just right, it sits there and floats above the pedestal with the magnetics all by itself. And pendulums with magnetic pieces inlaid into the bottom, and then where the pendulum swings, there's magnetic. And I mean, you literally drop the pendulum and it keeps moving for much longer than it normally would because of this magnetism. So they clearly had quite the understanding, and it's still going to require a lot more research until we have conclusive answers, but it's a start, and that's the story so far.